Thank you, Evan. Um, Very delighted to be here today, and certainly feel that I'm certainly walking amongst some very big giants. Um, and thank you, Alexander, for your presentation and discussion just now. I lived in Bangkok, and I recognized one of the buildings you put in your free city um, slide it looked like a building in Bangkok, which is just completed. And I would say Bangkok today is a very free city. You have all that chaos and whatnot. So very interesting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Grosvenor. We're a private company, and we focus exclusively on property development and investment in cities. And then I will walk you through some case studies from our portfolio and hopefully provide some relevant comments in relation to walkability from a private sector participant, from a company which cares very deeply about cities, about the built environment, and in particular our role in influencing and hopefully having a positive contribution in relation to the built environment and the cities that we all live in and love and hate at the same time. In our view, one cannot really have a discussion about walkability, about density, about cities, the built environment, without at least touching on the private sector, and ideally the private sector in partnership with a very broad range of constituents. I think we would also say, and this is a position that we're very privileged to be able to talk about, is that time horizon matters. So if there's one takeaway I would say to some of my property development peers, that would be certainly a call to think more diligently about time horizon. If I can get this to work. Okay, who are Grosvenor? We are a private property development company, an investor in property across the globe. We have exposure in 60 cities, offices in 17 cities. Our company is headquartered and continues to operate from a central base in London. We've been in London for 300 years. And we have had a very large estate, 1.2 square kilometers in the city center of London for that period of time. Grosvenor entered the North America market in the 1950s, Australia in the 1960s, and the Asia Pacific market in the 1990s. Last year, we made our first investment in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're continuing to expand, and our view is exclusively focused on cities. We consider ourselves very active asset managers. This is a slide of a place called Brownhart Gardens, which is in Mayfair in London. It's a terraced garden just south of Oxford Street. Those of you who are familiar with London will know that Oxford Street is one of the busiest streets in the West End. We engaged in a very extensive slate of public realm work related to Brownhart Gardens in 2013, and these were completed in 2015. One of the interesting takeaways, and I'm not sure that we are convinced that we necessarily had all of the solutions, but one of the key features of this particular tiny area really within Mayfair is a very dense population, but also an extremely diverse, socioeconomically diverse community. And that is a function of what you'll see on the right of the screen. This is low-income housing owned by a number of private trusts in the UK. And less than 100 meters away, you will have very high-end luxury boutiques, some very expensive real estate, literally cheek and jowl with a very low income community. And Grosvenor's take on this, very much as a thesis, but also as an investment decision, which we felt was, diligent in terms of being research based, is that a diversity in terms of socioeconomic residence was a strength and not a weakness in terms of this particular community. People associate Grosvenor and people associate the West End and Mayfair as a neighborhood for rich people, and that is why it is what it is today. But we consider this one of the examples of exactly the opposite and one of the strengths. The philosophy that we have articulated, which was an outgrowth of what was a fairly narrow sustainability vision, is a philosophy we call living cities. And again, going back to long-termism, it's a view from our owners, from our shareholders, that long-term matters, and in order to create value over the long term, we have to approach property and property development and asset management and investment in a holistic manner. Specifically, and again, we are exclusively city focused, we have developed as an underpinning to this philosophy our view on what makes cities robust. These are 8 dimensions, and this is the framework summarized in terms of how we now view our investment, our asset management, and our development decisions. We developed this internally. We worked with a number of external experts, drawing from people like Jan Gell, certainly a lot of our senior management team. I think Alexander mentioned Edward Glazer just now, really thinking quite deeply over a long period of time about what makes cities resilient and what makes our cities robust. In particular, we felt that the connected attributes of resilient and successful cities was really, really important. That speaks specifically to walkability, to the physical infrastructure of cities, links within the city as well as links from the city to other cities, to regions, and ultimately global links. And again, part of this dialogue was centered very much on neighborhoods, on community, on street life, and what is and what is not human scale. All of these aspects were considered very, very complementary. This is an example of one of the council PPP endeavors that we undertook in parallel with articulating this Living Cities philosophy. This is Mount Street in London. We worked with the Borough Council and undertook very extensive public realm work. We worked with the architect Tadao Ando to improve the entire streetscape of Mount Street and made it much more pedestrian friendly, much more walkable. There were, again, walkability, as we've heard over the past couple of days, really boils down to things as seemingly mundane as what is the width of the sidewalk, and is it the appropriate width, or is it too narrow or too wide? And spent a lot of time on that. This is one of our case studies, one of our examples. Closer to home here in Asia, we have sought to try to incorporate this philosophy in our developments here in Tokyo. These are 2 assets that we currently asset manage in Tokyo. Another example for us in Liverpool, being in the UK, anywhere really in the UK, and the mere idea of doing an open air shopping center, given the climate in the UK, was at the time considered something quite heretical. Why would you possibly consider doing that? That was a decision Grosvenor very consciously made because of this shopping mall site in the middle of Liverpool, and wanted to ensure that the pedestrian ingress and egress into this particular area, in some cases roads and streets that had been in existence for over 100 years, were preserved. Involving the community and being both an organizer of community events, being a supporter of other people's community events, we would say has to feature prominently. It is not just exclusively the built environment. Last year we participated globally in over 200 events. More than half of those were organized by ourselves. Again, if one gets more into the research, whether it's Glazer, whether it's others, the basic philosophy is your neighbors. Tenants who know their neighbors are more likely to renew. People who, crime levels, there is a direct correlation between tightly knit communities and communities which have a lot of transient residences. Again, all goes back to the same thing. Vancouver, I'll skip through this, running out of time. Again, closer to home here in Hong Kong, culture, and again, culture in the city and in the public realm, we have sought to be extremely active in. This is something we supported here locally in Hong Kong, Event Horizon last year. Anthony Gormley's city scale installation we supported. We have collaborated with Anthony Gormley previously in London. And we were very pleased and felt that this was important within a Hong Kong context. I want to perhaps close with something that goes from sort of 30,000-foot corporate philosophy down to what does this mean in practice. And maybe this next slide is a little bit better. As I mentioned before, it's our view that robust and resilient cities generally have are strong on 8 particular dimensions. This is one of a number of assessment tools that we've now developed internally in relation to actual buildings and actual investments, and how those investments and those assets can relate to those 8 dimensions. Again, we would say are common features in resilient cities. What we try to assess is our ability to influence across what are in each of those specific cities and specific neighborhoods the most pressing priorities. What we then do is to focus on, obviously, those areas which are both pressing in terms of that street, that neighborhood, that market, that submarket, and where our asset, be it a retail asset, an office building, a residential development, etc., can actually make an impact. This is, again, much closer to what we do on a sort of day-to-day basis. I wanted to talk a little bit about other case studies, but run out of time. That's it for me. This is an example which is not one of our projects, but I think something we took inspiration from. We think is very, very ambitious. This is in Copenhagen, but I'll perhaps let others who are more qualified to talk about that. Thank you.